The gunshot echoed through the valley just as Garrett Reed dismounted his horse, and he knew without looking that his solitary life had just been interrupted in ways he could not yet fathom. It was April 1878, and the Montana Territory stretched wild and unforgiving around his modest ranch outside Hecla, a settlement that barely deserved the name town. Garrett had chosen this isolation deliberately after the war, after watching too many men die for causes that seemed to matter less with each passing year. He wanted nothing more than to work his land, tend his cattle, and forget the world existed beyond the mountains that ringed his property like ancient sentinels. But the gunshot changed everything. Garrett was 30 years old, tall and weathered from years of outdoor living, his hands calloused and strong. His dark hair hung just past his collar, and his green eyes held a wariness that came from seeing the worst of humanity. He had built his ranch with his own 2 hands over the past 5 years, clearing the land, raising the buildings, surviving the brutal Montana winters alone, because that was exactly how he preferred it. The shot had come from the direction of the old Anderson place, a homestead that had sat abandoned for 2 years since the family packed up and headed back east. Garrett stood still, listening. Another shot rang out, then voices raised in anger. Against every instinct that told him to mind his own business, he found himself swinging back into the saddle and urging his horse toward the neighboring property. The Anderson house came into view as he crested the small rise, and what he saw made his blood run cold. 3 men on horseback circled the front yard, whooping and hollering, taking turns firing shots at the windows. But what caught Garrett's attention was the figure on the porch, a woman in a simple blue dress, standing her ground with a rifle raised to her shoulder. She fired, and one of the men yelped as his hat went flying. The other 2 laughed, clearly enjoying what they considered sport. Garrett recognized them, Billy Hatch and his cousins, troublemakers who had been run out of Virginia City the previous summer. Garrett rode down the slope at a gallop, his own rifle already in his hands. He fired a shot into the air, and the sound brought all 4 heads swiveling toward him. The woman's rifle never wavered from the men. "Time for you boys to move along," Garrett called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of giving orders during the war. Billy Hatch, a wiry man with a cruel mouth, turned his horse to face Garrett. "This ain't your concern, Reed. We are just having a conversation with the lady here about property rights." "Conversation is over," Garrett said, leveling his rifle at Billy's chest. "Ride out, or I will make you ride out." The 3 men exchanged glances. They knew Garrett's reputation, knew he had been a sharpshooter in the war, knew he did not make idle threats. After a tense moment, Billy spat on the ground and jerked his head at his cousins. "This is not finished," he said, but he was already turning his horse. Garrett kept his rifle ready until the 3 riders disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he dismount and turn his full attention to the woman on the porch. She had lowered her rifle but still held it ready, her stance suggesting she knew how to use it. "You have good timing," she said, and Garrett was struck by the steadiness in her voice. Most people would have been shaking after an encounter like that. "What are you doing at the Anderson place?" he asked, perhaps more gruffly than he intended. The woman stepped down from the porch, and Garrett got his first clear look at her. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her face was pretty in an understated way, with high cheekbones and dark brown eyes that assessed him with the same caution he felt toward her. Her dress was worn but clean, and she moved with a kind of determined grace. "I bought it," she said simply. "Or rather, I am buying it. Mr. Anderson sold it to me on contract before he left. I have been living here for 2 weeks now. Garrett frowned. Living here alone, something flashed in her eyes, a combination of defiance and wariness. That is my business. Those men will come back, Garrett said. Billy Hatch does not like being embarrassed, especially not by a woman. Then I will shoot them next time, she replied. I was aiming high today as a warning. Next time I will not be so generous. Despite himself, Garrett felt a flicker of admiration. You know how to use that rifle. My father taught me, she said. Taught me to shoot, to ride, to run a homestead. Everything I needed to know before he died. There was a weight of grief in those words, recent and raw. Garrett understood that kind of loss, the way it hollowed you out and left you searching for something to fill the empty spaces. I am Garrett Reed, he said. I have the ranch over the ridge about 2 miles east. The woman hesitated, then seemed to decide he deserved her name in return. Victoria Ashford, formerly of Bannack, more recently of nowhere in particular. You are a long way from anywhere out here, Garrett observed. That is the point, Victoria said, and he heard his own philosophy echoed back at him. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Garrett knew he should ride away, return to his own land and his own life. He had no desire to get tangled up in someone else's problems, especially not a woman's problems. Women meant complications, meant connections, meant all the things he had deliberately excised from his life. But he found himself saying, those men might come back tonight, you should keep watch. I intend to, Victoria said. I could stay, Garrett heard himself offer, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. Just until morning, make sure they do not try anything. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Why would you do that? It was a fair question. Garrett was not sure he had a good answer. Because they are cowards, he said finally, and I do not like cowards. She studied him for a long moment, and Garrett had the uncomfortable sensation of being thoroughly assessed. Finally, she nodded. You can sleep in the barn. I will bring you some supper. That is not necessary, Garrett started to say, but Victoria was already walking back into the house, rifle still in hand. Garrett led his horse to the barn, which was in better condition than he had expected. Someone had been working on it, fresh boards replacing rotten ones, the roof patched with new shingles. Inside, the space was clean and organized, hay stacked neatly, tools hung on the walls. Victoria Ashford was clearly not some city woman playing at homesteading. He unsaddled his horse and set up a simple camp in one of the empty stalls. True to her word, Victoria appeared an hour later with a plate of beans and cornbread, plus a tin cup of coffee. Thank you, Garrett said, accepting the food. It was good, better than anything he usually cooked for himself. Victoria lingered in the doorway, silhouetted against the setting sun. Mr. Reid, I want to be clear. I appreciate your help today, but I do not need a protector. I can take care of myself. I believe you, Garrett said and meant it. But even the most capable person can use an ally sometimes. She considered this. I suppose that is true. Good night, Mr. Reid. Good night, Miss Ashford. The night passed quietly. Garrett dozed lightly, waking at every sound, his rifle always within reach. But Billy Hatch and his cousins did not return. When dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Garrett emerged from the barn to find Victoria already up, working in the yard. He stopped dead at the sight. She was on her knees in the dirt in front of the house, her dress protected by an old apron, and she was planting flowers. Not vegetables for food, not herbs for medicine, but flowers. Delicate purple and yellow blooms that she set carefully into the earth, patting the soil around their roots with gentle hands. The sight was so unexpected, so at odds with the woman who had faced down 3 armed men the day before, that Garrett just stood and stared. Victoria must have sensed his presence because she looked up, her hands stilling. "Good morning," she said. There was something almost shy in her expression, as if she had been caught doing something foolish. "You are planting flowers," Garrett said, stating the obvious because his brain could not quite process it. Victoria's chin lifted slightly, that defiant tilt he was beginning to recognize. "Yes, in Montana, in April. These are hardy enough," she said. "Columbine and prairie smoke. They grow wild in the mountains. I transplanted them." "But why?" The question came out before he could stop it. Victoria looked down at the flowers, then back at the house, then finally at him. When she spoke, her voice was soft but determined. "I wanted to make your home beautiful." The words hit Garrett like a physical blow. Not his home. Your home. She had said it without thinking, a slip of the tongue that revealed more than she probably intended. This was not about beautifying her own space, though that was part of it. This was about creating something lovely in a harsh world, about bringing gentleness to the wild frontier. That is. Garrett struggled for words. That is a fine thing to do. Victoria smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face from pretty to beautiful. "My mother used to say that flowers are how we remind ourselves we are more than just surviving. We are living." Garrett felt something shift in his chest, a wall he had built so carefully beginning to crack. He cleared his throat. "I should get back to my ranch, got cattle to check on." "Of course," Victoria said, rising to her feet and brushing dirt from her apron. "Thank you again for staying." Garrett nodded, mounted his horse, and rode away. But he found himself looking back twice, watching Victoria return to her planting, determined to bring beauty to a place that had seen none for too long. Over the next week, Garrett told himself repeatedly that Victoria Ashford was none of his concern. She was a neighbor, nothing more. He had done his duty by helping her, and now they could return to being polite strangers who happened to live near each other. But he found himself riding past the Anderson place, taking routes that did not quite make sense just to see if everything looked all right. He told himself he was watching for signs of Billy Hatch returning, but deep down he knew it was more than that. The flowers kept haunting him. "I wanted to make your home beautiful." Such a simple statement, but it had burrowed under his skin, into the place where he kept all his loneliness locked away. 10 days after their first meeting, Garrett was mending fence when he heard a horse approaching. He looked up to see Victoria riding toward him on a sturdy mare, and his heart did something complicated in his chest. She pulled up a few yards away, sitting her horse with easy confidence. "Mr. Reed, Miss Ashford," he replied, setting down his tools. "Something wrong?" "No," she said. "I actually came to ask if you might help me with something. I would pay you, of course." Garrett frowned. "What kind of something?" "I need to plow the south field for planting," Victoria said. "My plow is not heavy enough for the work, and I thought you might have a better one. I could borrow it, or if you had time, I could hire you to do the plowing." It was a reasonable request, neighborly even. Garrett found himself nodding. "I will help you plow. No payment needed. Mr. Reed, I cannot ask you to work for free." "You are not asking," Garrett said. "I am offering." Neighbors help each other out here. That is how things work. Victoria studied him with those dark eyes, and Garrett wondered what she saw. Finally, she nodded. "Then I insist on at least feeding you while you work. It is only fair." They agreed he would come by the next morning with his plow and team. After Victoria rode away, Garrett stood in his half-mended fence line and wondered what he was doing. He had spent 5 years avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement. But there was something about Victoria Ashford that drew him despite his better judgment. The next morning was warm, promising an early summer. Garrett arrived at Victoria's property with his plow and 2 strong oxen, ready for a long day of work. Victoria met him wearing practical canvas pants under her skirt, her sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back with a simple ribbon. "The South Field," she said, leading him to a plot that had once been cultivated but had gone wild in the Andersons' absence. "I want to plant corn and beans, maybe some squash." Garrett nodded and set to work. The soil was good, dark and rich, and the plow cut through it cleanly once he got the oxen moving. It was hard, honest work, the kind that made muscles ache and sweat run, the kind Garrett had always found satisfying. Victoria did not just watch. She walked the furrows behind him, pulling out rocks and roots, clearing the ground. They worked in companionable silence for hours, the sun climbing higher, the field slowly transforming into neat rows ready for planting. Around noon, Victoria called a halt and brought out lunch, simple fare of bread and cheese and cold meat, but Garrett ate like it was a feast. They sat in the shade of a cottonwood at the field's edge, and for the first time they talked about more than just the immediate situation. "Where did you learn to farm?" Victoria asked. "My family had a farm in Ohio," Garrett said, "before the war. After I came back, there was nothing left worth saving. My parents had both died, my brother was killed at Gettysburg, and the farm had gone to ruin. I sold it and came west." "I am sorry," Victoria said quietly. "The war took so much from so many." "What about you?" Garrett asked. "How did you end up in Montana Territory?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, staring out at the partially plowed field. "My father had a mine near Bannack. Small operation, just him and a couple of hired men. He did well enough, found some gold, saved his money. When he died last winter, he left me everything. But Bannack had too many memories, too many people who thought a woman alone needed managing." She said the last word with distaste. "I heard about this property, made an offer, and here I am." "Billy Hatch and his cousins, they are still bothering you?" Garrett asked. "They rode by once," Victoria admitted. "Just looked and kept riding. I think they got the message." Garrett was not so sure, but he kept his concerns to himself. Instead, he found himself asking, "You ever get lonely out here?" Victoria met his eyes and something passed between them, a recognition of shared experience. "Sometimes," she said, "but lonely alone is better than lonely in a crowd. At least here I can be myself." Garrett understood that better than he wanted to admit. They worked until the sun started to sink toward the mountains, the field completely plowed and ready. Garrett's shoulders ached pleasantly, and he felt more satisfied than he had in weeks. "Thank you," Victoria said as he prepared to leave. "This would have taken me a week on my own." "Like I said, neighbors help each other," Garrett replied. Then, surprising himself, he added, "If you need anything else, you let me know." Victoria smiled that smile that made his chest feel strange. "I will, and Garrett," she paused. "Maybe we could skip the Mr. and Miss business. We are neighbors, after all." "Garrett it is then," he said, trying the sound of his name in her voice and liking it more than he should. "Good night, Victoria." "Good night, Garrett." He rode home under a darkening sky, aware that something fundamental had shifted. He had let Victoria Ashford past his defenses, and he was not entirely sure how it had happened. Over the following weeks, Garrett and Victoria fell into a pattern. He would stop by every few days, ostensibly to check that everything was all right, and somehow there always seemed to be small tasks that needed two people. Victoria never asked directly, but Garrett could see what needed doing, and he found himself wanting to do it. He helped her repair the chicken coop, then rode to town and bought her a dozen good-laying hens. Victoria protested the cost, but Garrett insisted, saying every homestead needed chickens. Together they fixed the sagging porch, replaced broken windows, and cleared brush from around the house. And always, there were the flowers. Victoria kept planting them, creating small gardens around the property. Columbine and prairie smoke gave way to wild roses transplanted from the creek bed, then lupine with their purple spikes reaching toward the sky. She even started a small herb garden near the kitchen door, mixing practical plants like sage and thyme with lavender for its scent. "You are going to have the prettiest ranch in Montana Territory," Garrett said one evening as they sat on the newly repaired porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "Pretty matters," Victoria said softly. "My mother used to say beauty is not frivolous, it is necessary. It feeds something in the soul that cannot survive on bread alone." Garrett thought about his own ranch, functional and efficient but utterly devoid of anything decorative. "I never thought of it that way." Victoria looked at him, and in the fading light her eyes were warm. "Maybe you should plant some flowers at your place." "I would not know what to plant," Garrett admitted. "I could help you," Victoria offered, "if you wanted." It was a simple offer, but it felt like more, like she was offering to bring some of her light into his carefully constructed darkness. Garrett should have declined, should have kept that distance, but instead he heard himself say, "I would like that." Victoria's smile was like sunrise. The next week, Victoria rode over to Garrett's ranch with a cloth bag full of seedlings. Garrett felt oddly nervous as she surveyed his property, taking in the neat but austere buildings, the functional but unadorned yard. "You keep everything very tidy," she observed. "Easier to maintain that way," Garrett said. Victoria walked slowly around the front of his house, and Garrett found himself seeing it through her eyes. It was well built, solid logs chinked tight against winter winds, a good roof, sturdy doors and windows. But it was stark, almost military in its precision. "There," Victoria said, pointing to a spot beside the front steps. "And there." Another spot on the other side. "And definitely there." She indicated a patch near the corner where the afternoon sun would hit. Together they planted columbine and prairie roses, lupine and Indian paintbrush. Victoria showed him how to prepare the soil, how to set the roots, how to water without drowning the delicate plants. Her hands in the dirt were sure and gentle, and Garrett found himself mesmerized by the sight. "Why flowers?" he asked as they worked. "I mean, I understand what you said about beauty, but why specifically flowers? Why not just trees or shrubs?" Victoria sat back on her heels, considering. "Flowers are hopeful," she said finally. "You plant them knowing they might not survive, that weather or animals or pure chance might kill them. But you plant them anyway because the possibility of beauty is worth the risk. Does that make sense?" Garrett looked at her dirt-streaked face, the way the sun caught the auburn highlights in her hair, the earnest hope in her eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. "That makes perfect sense." Something changed in that moment, in the space between one breath and the next. They were kneeling in the dirt less than a foot apart, and Garrett was suddenly acutely aware of Victoria's proximity, the faint scent of lavender that clung to her skin, the way her lips parted slightly as she looked at him. He wanted to kiss her. The realization struck him like lightning, sudden and electric. He wanted to close that small distance and find out if her lips were as soft as they looked. He wanted to pull her close and discover if she would fit against him the way he imagined she would. But he did not. Because Victoria had come here seeking freedom and independence, and she deserved to have those things without some lonely rancher complicating her life. So instead, Garrett cleared his throat and turned back to the flowers, patting soil around roots with hands that were not quite steady. If Victoria noticed the moment, she gave no sign. They finished planting and stood back to admire their work. The flowers looked small and fragile against the weathered logs of Garrett's house, but they were there, bright spots of color where none had been before. "They will grow," Victoria assured him. "By next month you will hardly recognize the place. Thank you," Garrett said. "For this, for all of it." Victoria looked up at him, shading her eyes against the sun. "You are welcome. Thank you for being a good neighbor, for being a friend. Friend." The word should have been enough. It was more than Garrett had allowed himself in years. But standing there with Victoria, her smile warming him more than the Montana sun, he knew friendship was not going to be enough. Not for long. Summer arrived in earnest, bringing long golden days and warm nights filled with stars. Garrett's flowers bloomed just as Victoria had promised, transforming his austere ranch into something softer. He found himself appreciating the splash of color every time he came home, found himself understanding what Victoria had meant about beauty feeding the soul. He and Victoria saw each other often now, their visits becoming routine. Sometimes Garrett would ride over to help with heavy work. Sometimes Victoria would appear at his ranch with fresh bread or a pot of stew, insisting he needed to eat better than his own poor cooking. They fell into an easy companionship that felt natural and right, like something that had always been meant to happen. But underneath the friendship, desire simmered. Garrett felt it every time Victoria laughed, every time their hands accidentally touched, every time she looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through his defenses. He wanted her with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified him. He tried to convince himself he was imagining the tension, that Victoria saw him only as a helpful neighbor. But there were moments, small and fleeting, when he caught her watching him with an expression he could not quite read. Times when her hand would linger on his arm a heartbeat longer than necessary. Instances when her breath would catch, and he would see color rise in her cheeks. It all came to a head on a hot July afternoon. Garrett had ridden over to Victoria's place to help her move some heavy furniture, rearranging the house to her liking. They had just wrestled a massive dresser into her bedroom when Victoria, flushed and breathless from exertion, turned to him with a brilliant smile. "Perfect," she said. "This is exactly where I wanted it." She was standing close enough that Garrett could see the sheen of perspiration on her skin, the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the way her hair had come loose from its pins in auburn curls around her face. She was beautiful, vibrant and alive, and everything he had been denying himself for 5 long years. "Victoria," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. She looked up at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her breath catch. "Yes." Garrett knew he should step back, should make some excuse and leave before he did something foolish. But he was tired of denying what he felt, tired of being alone, tired of pretending Victoria was just a neighbor when she had become so much more. "I need to tell you something," he said. Victoria nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "All right. These past months, getting to know you, spending time with you, it has been." Garrett struggled for words adequate to what he felt. "It has been the best time I have had since before the war. You have become important to me." "Very important." "You are important to me too," Victoria said softly. "No, I mean." Garrett took a breath. "Victoria, I have feelings for you, feelings that go beyond friendship. I tried not to. I know you came here for independence and peace, but I cannot seem to help it. You are all I think about." Victoria's eyes had gone wide, her lips parted in surprise. For a terrible moment, Garrett thought he had made a catastrophic mistake. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she whispered, "Oh, thank God." Before Garrett could process those words, Victoria had closed the distance between them, rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, questioning, but when Garrett wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close, it deepened into something hungry and desperate. She tasted like summer and sunshine and every good thing Garrett had thought lost to him forever, When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Victoria's eyes were shining. "I thought I was alone in this," she said. "I thought you only saw me as a neighbor, someone to help out of duty." "Never duty," Garrett said, his hands cupping her face, marveling that he was allowed to touch her like this. "Victoria, you walked into my life and turned everything upside down. You and your flowers and your belief that beauty matters. You made me want things I thought I was done wanting." "What things?" Victoria asked, her hands resting on his chest, and he could feel the tremble in her fingers. "A future," Garrett said simply. "Someone to share it with. A reason to make things beautiful instead of just functional." Victoria smiled through tears that had started to slip down her cheeks. "I wanted to make your home beautiful," she said. "But it was never really about the house, was it? I wanted to be part of your life. I wanted to matter to you." "You do matter," Garrett said fiercely. "You matter more than anything." He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring the softness of her lips, the way she sighed against his mouth, the perfect rightness of holding her. Years of loneliness fell away, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat and everything to do with the woman in his arms. When they finally left the bedroom, returning to the kitchen for water and the pretense of normalcy, they could not stop touching. Garrett kept reaching for Victoria's hand, and she would lean into him, her shoulder against his arm as if they needed constant contact to believe this was real. "What happens now?" Victoria asked as they sat at her kitchen table, hands intertwined. "I court you properly," Garrett said. "Take you to dinner in town, make my intentions clear to anyone who might have designs on you," Victoria laughed. "I do not think you have much competition out here." "Even so," Garrett insisted. "I want to do this right. You deserve to be courted, to be wooed, to have all the romance you want." "I want you," Victoria said simply. "Everything else is just details." Garrett brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "You have me, but I still want to court you. Let me do this properly, Victoria. Let me show you what you mean to me." Over the following weeks, Garrett did exactly that. He brought Victoria wildflowers he found on his land, bouquets of Indian paintbrush and mountain bluebells that made her laugh with delight. He took her to Hekla's small restaurant, which was really just a widow's front room where she served meals, and sat across from Victoria, holding her hand on top of the table where everyone could see. News spread quickly in small communities, and soon everyone within 20 miles knew that Garrett Reed was courting Victoria Ashford. Most folks were happy about it, pleased to see two solitary souls finding companionship. A few busybodies clucked about propriety and rushing into things, but Garrett and Victoria ignored them. Billy Hatch and his cousins were conspicuously absent. Garrett heard through the grapevine that they had moved on to cause trouble elsewhere, run out of the territory after trying to rustle cattle from the wrong rancher. Good riddance. In August, Garrett took Victoria to the county fair in Virginia City, a full day's ride away. They stayed in separate rooms at a boarding house, scrupulously proper, but spent every possible moment together. Garrett won Victoria a ribbon at the shooting competition, and she laughed until she cried when he tried and failed spectacularly at the greased pig contest. "I love you," Garrett said that night as they sat on the boarding house porch, watching Virginia City's lights twinkle in the darkness. Victoria turned to him, her eyes shining in the lamplight spilling from the windows. "I love you too. I think I have from the moment you rode down that hill to help me, all stern and protective and trying so hard to act like you did not care." "I cared," Garrett admitted. "I cared immediately, and it terrified me." "Not anymore, though?" Victoria asked. "Now it just feels right," Garrett said. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small box he had been carrying for a week, waiting for the perfect moment. "Victoria Ashford, Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small ruby, modest but genuine. Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "It is not much," Garrett said quickly, "but I can get you something finer later, something worthy of you." "Garrett Reed, if you think I care about the ring, you have not been paying attention," Victoria said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes. Yes. Of course, yes. I would marry you tomorrow if we could." Garrett slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and hope and joy flooding through him. Other people on the porch applauded and called out congratulations, but Garrett barely heard them. His entire world had narrowed to the woman in his arms and the future stretching out before them, bright with possibility. They were married a month later in the small church in Hecla, with half the county in attendance. Victoria wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs, and she had never looked more beautiful. Garrett wore his best suit, which he had not worn since coming to Montana, and tried not to shake as he waited for Victoria to walk down the aisle. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed Victoria with appropriate restraint for a church setting, though everything in him wanted to sweep her into his arms and never let go. The reception was held at their ranch, Garrett's ranch, which everyone had decided was bigger and better suited for hosting. Neighbors had brought food and set up tables in the yard, and someone produced a fiddle for dancing. Victoria had insisted on planting more flowers for the occasion, and the ranch was a riot of late summer blooms, beautiful and wild and perfect. As the sun set and the celebration continued, Garrett stole a moment alone with his wife, leading her away from the party to the small garden she had planted by his front steps. "Happy?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Victoria leaned back against his chest, her hands covering his where they rested on her waist. "Happier than I ever imagined being." "You, the same," Garrett said. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I keep thinking about that day I found you planting flowers. You said you wanted to make my home beautiful." "I did," Victoria said softly. "You succeeded," Garrett told her. "But not because of the flowers, though I love them. You made it beautiful by being in it, by being willing to be part of my life. You took something that was just a place to sleep and eat and turned it into a home." Victoria turned in his arms, looking up at him with eyes full of love. "We made it a home together. That is how it works now. We do everything together." "Together," Garrett agreed, kissing her again as music and laughter drifted from their yard, their friends celebrating their union under the vast Montana sky. The first year of marriage brought adjustments and discoveries. Victoria moved into Garrett's ranch, though she kept her property as well, using it for additional crops and livestock. They combined their herds and resources, working side by side to build something larger and more prosperous than either could have achieved alone. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, the small intimacies of shared life. Victoria learned that Garrett was grumpy before his morning coffee, and that he sang badly but enthusiastically when he thought he was alone. Garrett discovered that Victoria talked in her sleep, and that she was terrible at remembering to bank the fire at night but brilliant at managing their finances. They had their first real fight in November over whether to buy additional cattle or save the money for winter expenses. Victoria wanted to expand to take a calculated risk. Garrett wanted to be cautious to ensure they could weather any storm. They both said things they regretted, and Victoria locked herself in the bedroom for 3 hours. Finally, Garrett knocked on the door. "Victoria, please. I cannot stand you being angry with me." The door opened, and Victoria stood there with red eyes but a calm expression. "I am not angry. Well, I am, but not just angry. I am frustrated because you will not trust me to know what I am talking about. I understand ranching, Garrett. I am not some foolish woman making decisions on whims. I know that, Garrett said. I do. I am sorry. I am not used to sharing decisions and I fell back into old habits. What do you think we should do? They talked it through properly this time, really listening to each other, and reached a compromise. They would buy some additional cattle but keep a larger cash reserve than Victoria had initially wanted. It would not be the last fight, but they had learned how to navigate conflict together, with respect and love. Winter was hard that year, one of the worst Montana had seen in decades. Snow piled 6 feet high in places, and temperatures dropped so low that water froze in seconds. Garrett and Victoria spent long hours tending livestock, breaking ice, hauling feed. They lost a few cattle despite their best efforts, but far fewer than many of their neighbors. On the worst nights, when wind howled around the house and cold seeped through even the best chinked walls, Garrett and Victoria would huddle together under every blanket they owned. Victoria would read aloud from the few books they possessed, and Garrett would hold her close, grateful beyond words that he was not facing the winter alone. Spring arrived eventually, as it always did, and with it came muddy fields and melting snow and the first green shoots pushing through the earth. Victoria's flowers, dormant through winter, began to bloom again, splashes of color that reminded them beauty survived even the harshest seasons. In April, exactly 1 year after Garrett had first seen Victoria planting flowers, she told him she was pregnant. They were working in the garden together, preparing to plant vegetables, when Victoria suddenly sat back on her heels and said, "I have news." Something in her voice made Garrett's heart skip. "What kind of news?" "The good kind," Victoria said, her smile radiant. "The very good kind. We are going to have a baby, Garrett, in October, near as I can figure." Garrett stood frozen for a moment as the information sank in. A baby. He and Victoria were going to have a child. The idea was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. "Garrett," Victoria's voice held a note of uncertainty. "Are you all right?" He dropped to his knees beside her, pulling her into his arms. "I am better than all right. I am happy. Scared out of my mind, but happy." "Are you all right? How do you feel?" "Tired," Victoria admitted, "and queasy in the mornings, but happy too, so happy." They sat in the garden holding each other, imagining the future. A child would change everything, would add complexity and challenge to their already demanding lives. But it would also add joy and hope and the promise of something enduring. Victoria's pregnancy progressed normally, though the summer heat was hard on her. Garrett became fiercely protective, hovering and worrying until Victoria threatened to send him to sleep in the barn if he did not give her space to breathe. But she said it with love, and she never pushed away the small gestures of care, the way Garrett would bring her cool water or insist she rest in the afternoon. In early October, as aspen leaves turned gold on the mountainsides, Victoria went into labor. Garrett had arranged for a midwife from Hecla, a capable woman named Mrs. Thompson, who had delivered half the babies in the county. She arrived with reassuring competence and shooed Garrett from the bedroom. The labor lasted 14 hours, and they were the longest 14 hours of Garrett's life. He paced, he prayed, he bargained with God, promising anything if Victoria and the baby would be all right. Every cry from the bedroom made his heart seize with fear. Finally, as dawn was breaking, he heard a different sound, the thin, angry wail of a newborn. Garrett sagged against the wall in relief. Minutes later, Mrs. Thompson opened the door, beaming. "You have a son," she announced. "A healthy boy with a fine set of lungs on him, and your wife did beautifully. She wants to see you." Garrett entered the bedroom on shaking legs. Victoria lay in bed, pale and exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up as he approached, and the love in her eyes made his breath catch. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Garrett sat carefully on the edge of the bed, looking down at the tiny red face just visible among the blankets. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a scrunched expression of general displeasure with the world. He was perfect. "He is beautiful," Garrett whispered, touching one impossibly small hand with a tentative finger. The baby's fingers reflexively closed around his, and Garrett felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "What should we name him?" Victoria asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had never quite decided. Now, looking at his son, Garrett knew. "James," he said, "after my brother, James Reed, if that suits you." "James," Victoria repeated, trying it out. "Yes, I like that. Hello, James." Little James Reed grew quickly, thriving under the doting attention of both parents. He was a good-natured baby, quick to smile, curious about everything. Garrett built him a cradle that could be moved around the house, so Victoria could keep him close while she worked. They took turns walking him when he fussed at night, pacing the floor and singing lullabies in the darkness. Parenthood changed them, brought a new dimension to their relationship. They were not just husband and wife anymore, but partners in the profound responsibility of raising a child. It was exhausting and overwhelming, and the most meaningful thing either of them had ever done. The years flowed past, marked by seasons and milestones. James took his first steps just after his first birthday, wobbling across the kitchen floor into Victoria's waiting arms. He spoke his first word at 15 months, "Mama," which made Victoria cry happy tears. His second word a few days later was "Dada," and Garrett felt a pride so fierce it was almost painful. When James was 2, Victoria became pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the first, and she was often sick and tired. But she never complained, and Garrett did his best to take up the slack, managing both ranch work and household tasks. Their daughter was born in the spring, during a thunderstorm that shook the house. She came quickly, so quickly there was barely time to fetch the midwife. Garrett ended up assisting with the birth himself, guided by Victoria's calm instructions even as she labored to bring their daughter into the world. "A girl," Garrett said, awestruck, as he placed the squalling infant on Victoria's chest. "We have a daughter." "Sarah," Victoria said immediately, "after my mother, Sarah Reed." Sarah was different from James, more demanding, more vocal about her displeasure. She kept them up at all hours, refused to nap, and had a temper that seemed outsized for such a tiny person. But she also had Victoria's auburn hair and Garrett's green eyes, and when she smiled, it was like the sun breaking through clouds. With 2 young children, the ranch became busier and more chaotic. Garrett could not ride out to check cattle without wondering what crisis he would return to. Victoria could not get through a simple task like making bread without interruption. But there was also more laughter, more joy, more moments of simple happiness than Garrett had ever imagined possible. He would come in from the fields to find Victoria on the floor with the children, building block towers for James to knock down while Sarah shrieked with laughter. Or he would wake in the night to find Victoria nursing Sarah, James curled up between them in bed, though he had his own room now, and feel such contentment it was almost painful. When James was 5 and Sarah 3, Victoria told Garrett she wanted to plant a real flower garden, not just the scattered blooms she had been adding over the years, but something planned and beautiful. Garrett, who would have given her anything she wanted, helped her stake out a plot near the house, sheltered from wind but open to sun. They worked together that spring, preparing the soil, planning what would go where. James helped by digging holes in random places, and Sarah mostly sat in the dirt and ate it until Victoria caught her. It was messy and inefficient and perfect. As they planted, Victoria said, "Remember the first time we did this? When I came to your ranch and we planted those first flowers?" "I remember," Garrett said. "I remember thinking you were crazy planting flowers in Montana." Victoria laughed. "You thought I was crazy before that, probably from the moment we met." "Maybe a little," Garrett admitted, "but you were right. About the flowers, about beauty mattering, about all of it. Look at what you have created here, Victoria. Look at what we have built together." They surveyed their domain, the neat buildings and productive fields, the children playing in the dirt, the mountains rising majestic in the distance. The flowers Victoria had planted over the years bloomed everywhere, wild profusion of color that softened the harsh landscape. "It is beautiful," Victoria agreed. "Our home is beautiful. Our life is beautiful. Not perfect, certainly not easy, but beautiful in the ways that matter." That summer, disaster struck in the form of a wildfire. It started somewhere up in the mountains and raced down the slopes, driven by wind and fed by dry brush. Garrett saw the smoke in the afternoon and knew immediately they were in danger. He and Victoria worked frantically to create fire breaks, wetting down the buildings, moving livestock to safety. Neighbors came to help, rallying together as frontier communities did in crisis. They fought the fire through the night, beating back flames, saving what they could. By dawn, the fire had passed, leaving behind scorched earth and smoking ruins. But the house still stood, and the barn, and most importantly, everyone was safe. They had lost some pasture land and several outbuildings, but it could have been so much worse. Standing in the ash-covered yard, exhausted and smoke-stained, Victoria suddenly began to cry. Garrett pulled her close and she sobbed against his chest. "The flowers," she wept. "All the flowers are gone." Garrett looked around and saw she was right. Victoria's carefully tended gardens were nothing but ash and blackened stems. Years of work destroyed in a single night. "We will plant more," he told her. "This spring, we will plant twice as many, 3 times as many. We will make it beautiful again, Victoria, I promise." She nodded against his chest, then pulled back and wiped her eyes. "You are right. They are just flowers. They will grow back. Everything that matters is still here." And it was true. The house stood, the family was safe, and the land would recover. By the following spring, green shoots were already pushing through the ash-enriched soil, nature reclaiming what fire had taken. True to his word, Garrett helped Victoria replant her gardens, bigger and more ambitious than before. Neighbors contributed seeds and seedlings, everyone wanting to help restore what had been lost. By summer, the ranch was once again bright with blooms, perhaps more beautiful for having been rebuilt. Life continued its rhythm, years marked by small joys and occasional sorrows. James grew into a thoughtful boy who loved the land as much as his father did. Sarah was wild and fearless, climbing trees and riding horses almost before she could walk properly. When James was 8 and Sarah 6, Victoria gave birth to another son, whom they named Thomas after Victoria's father. Thomas was a happy baby, content to observe the world with serious dark eyes. He adored his older siblings and would watch them play for hours, gurgling approval at their antics. His arrival completed their family in a way Garrett had not realized was missing. The children grew, and the ranch prospered. Garrett and Victoria had built something enduring, not just a successful homestead, but a real home filled with love and laughter. They faced challenges, droughts and harsh winters, illness and injury, but they faced them together, their partnership growing stronger with each trial weathered. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Garrett took Victoria back to the boarding house in Virginia City where he had proposed. They left the children with neighbors, a rare luxury of time alone together. The boarding house looked exactly the same, and they sat on the same porch where Garrett had offered Victoria the ruby ring she still wore. 10 years, Victoria said, leaning against Garrett's shoulder. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime and sometimes like no time at all. Do you ever regret it? Garrett asked. Coming out here, marrying me this life. Victoria lifted her head to look at him, surprise clear on her face. Regret it. Garrett, marrying you was the best decision I ever made. This life we have built together, our children, our home, all of it is better than anything I could have imagined for myself. Even with the hardships, Garrett pressed. The fires and the winters and the endless work, especially with those, Victoria said firmly. The hard times make the good times sweeter, and we have faced everything together. That is what matters. I would rather struggle beside you than have an easy life anywhere else. Garrett pulled her close and kissed her, and it felt like the first time all over again, that same rush of love and desire and profound gratitude that this woman had chosen to share her life with him. As the years advanced, their children grew toward independence. James, at 15, was nearly as tall as Garrett and could handle most ranch work on his own. Sarah, 13, had her mother's determination and her father's skill with horses and was already talking about starting her own breeding program. Thomas, at 7, was still young but showing signs of his father's thoughtful nature and his mother's creative spirit. Garrett and Victoria, now in their 40s, found themselves with occasional moments of quiet they had not experienced since, before James was born. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the mountains, hands intertwined, comfortable in the silence that came from years of deep companionship. You remember the first thing you said to me? Garrett asked one evening, after I ran off Billy Hatch and his cousins. Victoria thought back. I said you had good timing. No, after that, Garrett said. When I asked what you were doing at the Anderson place, you said you had bought it and I asked if you were living alone. Do you remember what you said? I said it was my business, Victoria recalled, smiling at the memory of her younger, more defensive self. You were so fierce, Garrett said. So determined to prove you did not need anyone's help. I admired that even as it frustrated me. I did need help though, Victoria admitted. I needed you, even if I was too stubborn to admit it then. You helped me make that place livable and then you convinced me to make this place home. No, Garrett corrected gently. You did that. You made it home, I just provided the house. Victoria squeezed his hand. We made it home together. That is the truth of it. Neither of us could have built this life alone. We needed each other. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky. The flowers Victoria had planted all those years ago had multiplied and spread, generations of blooms that returned faithfully each spring. They were a living testament to Victoria's belief that beauty mattered, that hope was worth planting even in uncertain soil. As full darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, Garrett thought about that April day in 1878 when a gunshot had interrupted his solitary life. He had been so certain he wanted to be alone, so convinced that isolation was the same as safety. How wrong he had been. Victoria had taught him that a life shared was infinitely richer than a life lived in solitude. She had shown him that love was worth the risk of pain, that beauty was worth the effort of creation, that hope was worth maintaining even when circumstances suggested otherwise. What are you thinking about? Victoria asked, and Garrett realized he had been quiet for a while. That gunshot, he said. The one that brought me to you. I think about it sometimes, how different my life would be if I had ignored it, stayed on my own land, minded my own business. Unbearable, Victoria said simply. That is what your life would be, because it is what mine would be without you. Garrett pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. I love you, Victoria Reed, more now than the day we married, more than I thought it was possible to love another person. I love you too, Victoria said. My stubborn, wonderful, flower-planting husband. They laughed together, then fell silent again. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a beautiful life in a harsh land, who had learned that the most important things in life were not the big, dramatic moments but the small, daily choices to love, to hope, to believe in the possibility of beauty. The years continued to pass, bringing more changes. James married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, and Garrett helped him build a house on a piece of land they divided off from the main ranch. Sarah, true to her word, started breeding horses, developing a reputation throughout the territory for quality stock. Thomas surprised everyone by showing more interest in books than ranching, and Victoria encouraged his education, seeing in him possibilities beyond the frontier. Garrett and Victoria became grandparents, first to James and his wife's twin daughters, then to more grandchildren as the years went by. The ranch that had once been Garrett's solitary refuge became a family compound, multiple generations working the land, building lives, creating futures. Through it all, Victoria maintained her flowers. Even as she aged, even as arthritis began to stiffen her joints and make planting difficult, she insisted on tending her gardens. Garrett often found her on her knees in the dirt, moving slowly but with the same loving care she had shown from the beginning. "You are going to hurt yourself," he would scold gently, helping her to her feet. "Then I will hurt myself doing something I love," Victoria would reply, brushing dirt from her skirt. "These flowers are important, Garrett. They are my legacy, proof that I was here, that I made this place more than it was." But her real legacy, Garrett knew, was not the flowers. It was the family she had created, the love she had nurtured, the home she had built through years of patient care. The flowers were beautiful, yes, but they were just a symbol of something larger and more enduring. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Garrett surprised Victoria with a trip back to the place where they had first met, her old property that they still owned but now leased to a young couple starting out. The house had been maintained and improved over the years, and it looked prosperous and well-loved. "You remember standing on that porch with a rifle, facing down 3 men?" Garrett asked as they stood in the yard. "I remember being terrified," Victoria admitted, "and trying so hard not to show it. Then this stern stranger came riding down the hill like avenging justice, and I thought maybe I was not as alone as I felt." "You were never alone after that," Garrett said. "Even before we admitted how we felt, you were not alone. I was watching over you, whether you wanted me to or not." Victoria smiled. "I wanted you to. I just could not admit it, not even to myself. I was so determined to prove I could manage on my own that I almost missed the gift of having someone who wanted to stand beside me." They walked to the spot where Victoria had been planting flowers that first day, where Garrett had found her, and heard those words that changed everything. The area was still planted with flowers, maintained by the current residents at Victoria's request. Columbine and prairie smoke, the same hardy blooms she had chosen all those years ago, still returned each spring. "I wanted to make your home beautiful," Victoria said softly, echoing words she had spoken 3 decades earlier. "I had no idea then what those words would mean, what we would build together." "You succeeded beyond measure," Garrett told her, pulling her close. "Our home is beautiful, our life is beautiful, and it is all because you believed beauty was worth creating." They stood together in the place where their story had truly begun. Two people who had found each other in the wild vastness of Montana territory, who had chosen love over loneliness, hope over despair, beauty over mere survival. Years later, when Garrett was in his 60s and Victoria nearing 60, they sat on their porch on a spring evening, surrounded by grandchildren playing in the yard. The mountains were purple in the fading light, and Victoria's flowers bloomed in wild profusion, generations of plants that had spread and multiplied until the entire ranch was a riot of color. "We built something good," Victoria said, watching their youngest grandson chase his sister through the flowers. "Something that will last." "We did," Garrett agreed. "And it started with you planting flowers, believing that beauty mattered even in the wilderness." "It started with you riding to help a stranger," Victoria corrected, "caring enough to get involved even though you wanted to be left alone." "Maybe it started with both," Garrett suggested. "Two lonely people finding each other when they needed it most." Victoria leaned her head on Garrett's shoulder, the gesture as natural as breathing after 35 years of marriage. "However it started, I am grateful for every day, every moment, every challenge and joy we have shared." "As am I," Garrett said, pressing a kiss to her silver-streaked hair. "As am I." They sat together as twilight deepened into night, as they had sat countless evenings before and would sit countless evenings yet. Around them, the ranch hummed with life, children and grandchildren, livestock and growing things. All the proof anyone could need that two people determined to create beauty could transform wilderness into home, loneliness into love, survival into something approaching grace. The flowers Victoria had planted that first spring, those hopeful blooms in harsh soil, had been more prophetic than either of them could have known. Like those flowers, their love had taken root in unlikely ground, had survived drought and fire and bitter winter, had bloomed and multiplied and spread until it touched everything around them. And each spring, when the columbine and prairie smoke returned, Garrett remembered that April day when a woman knelt in the dirt planting beauty, when she looked up at him and spoke words that would change his life forever. She had wanted to make his home beautiful, and she had succeeded in ways that went far beyond flowers and gardens. She had made his life beautiful, had filled his heart with love he thought lost forever, had given him a family and a future he had never dared to imagine. That was the real miracle of Victoria's flowers, not that they bloomed in Montana's harsh climate, but that they symbolized something infinitely more precious. The possibility of hope, the power of love, and the enduring truth that beauty, once planted with care and tended with devotion, could transform the world. As Garrett and Victoria grew older still, moving into their 70s, they gradually handed over the daily running of the ranch to their children. James proved to be a capable and innovative rancher, implementing new techniques while respecting the foundation his parents had built. Sarah's horse breeding operation had become famous throughout Montana and into neighboring territories. Thomas, following his scholarly bent, had become a teacher, though he returned often to help with the ranch and to ensure his parents were well cared for. The transition was not always easy. Garrett struggled with relinquishing control, with trusting that his life's work would be maintained properly. But Victoria, with her usual wisdom, reminded him that they had raised their children well, had taught them everything they needed to know. It was time to trust them. "We cannot hold on forever," she said gently one evening, "and we raised them to do this. Let them." So Garrett let go bit by bit and found that retirement had its own pleasures. He had time to sit with Victoria, to take slow rides through the property, to watch grandchildren grow, and to appreciate the life they had built without the constant pressure of maintaining it single-handedly. Victoria's health began to decline in her mid-70s. Nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of age's toll. Her joints ached more, her breath came shorter, her steps grew slower. But her spirit remained undimmed, and she still insisted on tending her flowers, though now she directed grandchildren on what to plant and where, supervising rather than doing the work herself. Garrett watched her with a mixture of love and fear. The thought of losing Victoria was unbearable, yet he knew death came for everyone eventually. He tried to cherish each day, each moment, tried to show her in 1,000 small ways how much she meant to him. On a warm June evening in 1923, 45 years after they had first met, Victoria asked Garrett to help her walk to her flower garden. She leaned heavily on his arm, but she was smiling, eager to see how the season's blooms had progressed. They stood together among the flowers, surrounded by the descendants of those first hardy plants Victoria had transplanted from the wild. The garden had grown to encompass a substantial part of the yard, a testament to decades of patient cultivation. "Do you remember what I said that first day you found me planting?" Victoria asked. "Every word," Garrett replied. "You said you wanted to make my home beautiful." Victoria nodded slowly. "I did make it beautiful, did I not? Not just the flowers, but everything. We made it beautiful together." "The most beautiful place in the world," Garrett confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. Victoria turned to look at him, her dark eyes still bright despite her aged face. "I need you to promise me something." "Anything," Garrett said. "When I am gone, keep the flowers," Victoria said. "Do not let the garden die. It is my legacy, my mark on this place. Promise me you will keep it alive." "You are not going anywhere," Garrett said, though he knew it was a lie, knew that time was running short. "Promise me," Victoria insisted. "I promise," Garrett said. "I will keep every flower alive, will plant more every spring, will make sure this garden thrives for as long as I live." Victoria smiled and leaned against him. "Good. That is good." They stood together among the blooms as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was, Garrett thought, a perfect moment, the kind Victoria had always believed in, creating beauty worth the effort, love worth the risk. Victoria passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 weeks later, Garrett beside her, holding her hand. She was 76 years old, and she had lived a full, rich life. But Garrett felt her loss like the loss of part of himself, as if half his soul had departed with her. The funeral was large, attended by family and friends from across Montana. Victoria had touched many lives with her kindness and strength, and people came to pay respects and share memories. They buried her on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains she had loved and the gardens she had created. Garrett stood beside her grave after everyone had left, alone with his grief. "I kept my promise," he told the fresh-turned earth. "The gardens are thriving. I will make sure they always do." The weeks after Victoria's death were the hardest of Garrett's life, harder even than the war, harder than the years of solitary struggle before he met her. Everything reminded him of her absence. The empty chair at the table, the quiet house, the bed too big for one person. He moved through his days in a fog of loss, performing necessary tasks without really being present. But he kept his promise about the flowers. Every morning, Garrett tended Victoria's gardens, watering and weeding, deadheading spent blooms and encouraging new growth. His children offered to take over the task, worried about the physical toll on their 77-year-old father, but Garrett refused. "I promised her," he said simply, and they understood. As the summer progressed and Garrett spent hours among the flowers, he began to feel Victoria's presence again. Not her physical presence, which he would never stop missing, but her spirit, her essence, woven into every bloom she had planted. The gardens were her love made tangible, her belief in beauty transformed into living proof. He began to heal slowly, the sharp edges of grief dulling into something more manageable. He would never stop missing Victoria, never stop wishing for one more day, one more conversation, one more evening watching the sunset together. But he learned to live with her absence, to find comfort in memories, to see her legacy everywhere he looked. One spring morning, a year after Victoria's death, Garrett's great-granddaughter found him in the garden. She was 6 years old, Victoria's namesake, with the same auburn hair and determined spirit. "Great-grandpa, what are you doing?" she asked. "Planting flowers," Garrett said. "Just like your great-grandmother taught me." "Why do we plant flowers?" young Victoria asked. "They do not feed us like vegetables." Garrett smiled, remembering asking Victoria almost the same question decades earlier. "Because beauty matters," he told the child. "Because we are more than just surviving. We are living. Your great-grandmother believed that with all her heart, and she was right." "Can I help?" Victoria asked. "I would love that," Garrett said. Together they planted, Garrett's gnarled hands and the child's small ones working the soil, setting roots, creating beauty. As they worked, Garrett told stories about the original Victoria, about her courage and strength, about how she had transformed a lonely ranch into a home, about the love that had sustained them through decades. Young Victoria listened with rapt attention, and Garrett could see her absorbing the stories, making them part of her own understanding of the world. This was how legacy worked, he realized, not just through the flowers but through the stories, through the lessons passed down generation to generation. Garrett lived to be 83 years old, tending Victoria's gardens until the very end. He spent his final years surrounded by family, secure in the knowledge that what he and Victoria had built would endure. The ranch would continue, the flowers would bloom each spring, and the love they had shared would echo through the generations they had created. On a warm September evening, Garrett sat on his porch, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The mountains were purple in the fading light, and Victoria's flowers bloomed in glorious profusion, their colors brilliant against the darkening sky. "Tell us again," young Victoria asked, curled up beside him. "Tell us about the day you met great-grandma," Garrett smiled, always willing to revisit that memory. "I heard a gunshot," he began, and the children settled in to hear the familiar story. "I rode over the ridge, and there were 3 men causing trouble, and a woman on the porch with a rifle. Your great-grandmother, the bravest, most stubborn woman I ever met." He told them about running off the troublemakers, about Victoria's fierce independence, about finding her the next morning planting flowers in the harsh Montana soil. He told them about her saying she wanted to make his home beautiful, about how those simple words had opened his heart to possibilities he had thought lost forever. "And did she?" young Victoria asked, even though she had heard the story countless times and knew the answer. "Did she make your home beautiful?" "She made everything beautiful," Garrett said softly, his eyes on the flowers that still bloomed because Victoria had believed they should, because she had planted hope in unlikely soil and tended it with love. "Everything." As the stars emerged overhead and the family gathered close, Garrett felt at peace. He had lived a good life, a beautiful life, rich with love and purpose. He had been blessed beyond measure by the woman who had planted flowers and believed in beauty, who had taught him that opening your heart was worth the risk, that love could transform loneliness into joy. Garrett Reed passed away in his sleep that night, peacefully, surrounded by the family he and Victoria had created. They buried him beside Victoria on the hill, And when they laid flowers on both graves, it seemed fitting that columbine and prairie smoke were among the blooms, the same hardy flowers Victoria had planted that first spring, still thriving after all these years. The ranch continued to flourish under James's management and eventually his children's. Victoria's gardens were maintained by each generation, expanded and improved but always true to her original vision. The story of how Garrett found Victoria planting flowers, how she said she wanted to make his home beautiful, became family legend, told and retold, a reminder of where they came from and what mattered most. Years became decades, and the Montana Territory became the state of Montana, and the wild frontier was gradually tamed. But on one particular ranch outside Hecla, Victoria's flowers still bloomed each spring, and people still remembered the woman who believed beauty was worth creating, and the man who learned to believe with her. Their love story, which began with a gunshot and a woman planting flowers, had transformed two lonely people into a family that would span generations. It proved that love planted with care, like Victoria's flowers, could take root in the most unlikely soil and bloom into something that would outlast any single lifetime. And every spring, when the columbine and prairie smoke returned, pushing through the earth in wild profusion of purple and pink, those who remembered would smile and think of Victoria Ashford Reed, who had wanted to make a home beautiful and had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. She had created beauty not just in flowers but in lives touched, love shared, and hope maintained against all odds. That was the true legacy of the woman who planted flowers in the Montana wilderness, the woman who taught a lonely rancher that beauty mattered, that love was worth the risk, and that home was not just a place, but a feeling created through years of patient cultivation, as tender and determined as hands setting roots into soil, as faithful as flowers returning each spring, as enduring as love that survives beyond death to bloom eternal in the hearts of those left behind.